we will terrorize you, we will kidnap you, we will burn you, we will murder you, and you can do nothing about it. My dad was targeted by the regime since the beginning of his work, holding him hostage for the last 4 years inside of Iran.
So it was all planned long time ago to get the world to the stage that the world now is. Dames en heren, welkom bij dit exclusieve interview met een bijzondere gast, Giselle Charmat. Vandaag spreken we niet alleen met een activist, maar met een vrouw die persoonlijk de tol heeft gevoeld van de wrede hand van het Iraanse regime. Haar vader, Jamshid Charmat, een voorvechter van vrijheid en waarheid, wordt gegijzeld door datzelfde regime. Terwijl de wereld naar het Midden-Oosten kijkt, speelt het Iraanse regime een sinistere rol in het sponsoren van terreur, het destabiliseren van de regio en het aanvallen van onschuldige burgers. Vandaag laat ik jullie de andere kant van het verhaal horen en we gaan het hebben onder andere over de strijd en de waarheid. I'm excited to talk with Ghazaleh Charmat, a remarkably strong woman, human rights activist and daughter of hostage Jamshid Charmat. We share the same homeland, and perhaps that's why we deeply understand and empathize with each other's pain and concern about the state of the world. Ghazaleh Jan, I'm so proud to have you in my show. You are remarkable, as I said, and you have an unbelievable story. Could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to speak with people who are like-minded and who give us a voice, because I think the Iranian community, the dissidents outside of Iran, are very underrepresented in the media right now. And we have a long story that we would like to share. As you said, my name is Giselle Charmat. I'm the daughter of Jamshid Charmat. My dad is just like me, a German and an American. We live in America now for the last 2 decades, and he is a dissident. He is a journalist who had a website and a radio station and was very critical against the Islamic regime. And as we both know, when you're critical against this jihadist regime, you are in danger, especially when you're in public and very effective in what you're doing. So my dad was targeted by the regime since the beginning of his work. They did threats to his life up until 2009, when they sent assassins to Los Angeles, where we live, to murder my father, to murder my family. And thankfully that was foiled, but they never stopped. They never stopped trying to silence my father and my family. And in 2020, unfortunately, they were able to kidnap my father, who had a flight overlay in 2020 in Dubai, and they took him through 2 state borders, to Oman and then to Iran. And they're holding him hostage for the last 4 years inside of Iran. And since that day, I've been the public person in the family speaking out on behalf of my father, on behalf of hostages, and on behalf of the people of Iran who have the same story that my dad was telling. He was the voice of the people of Iran, and his voice has been taken. And since then, I'm out there and trying to be as loud as I can to save his life and to shed some light into what is going on in Iran and what is going on in the world.
What's the situation right now in Iran? Do you have any contact with him?
For my father, unfortunately, no. There are some hostages, the Islamic regime, since day one, since 1979, when they took power of our country by force, through a coup, through an Islamic coup. They always call it a revolution, but in effect, experts know it was an Islamo-Marxist coup, and they took over the power of our country. Since then, day one, they started with acts of transnational terrorism. The first act of terrorism was taking the entire US embassy inside of Tehran hostage for 444 days. Now, most people are familiar with that, but the hostage taking never stopped. So since then, for the last 45 years, Europeans, Americans, Canadians, Australian citizens, all have been held hostage inside of Iran and then used as bargaining chips. And some of these hostages are in prisons where somebody can go and see them. And some of these hostages, we don't even know where they are. My father, as a dissident, like most dissident, is not kept in some prison where you can see him. He's kept like the hostages are kept in Gaza right now, in tunnels or safe houses or somewhere where even the public, like the German embassy or the Americans, cannot get access to. So once or twice a year, he's allowed one phone call to my family just as a sign of life. So we know that he's still alive. We still know that he's still breathing. And we know that there's still hope to somehow save his life and get him out there.
Okay. How do you get any updates about him? How do you get any information?
In these phone calls, usually my father, because he's a very smart man. My father is a very, very smart man, even though he is 69 now and has Parkinson's disease. His brain still is very, very sharp, thankfully. So when we get the chance to talk to him, he tries to get us as much information as he can. Though the guards, the people who are torturing him day in and day out, are next to him in the phone call. So he has to be very smart on how to deliver that information. But throughout the last 4 years, we have been able to understand that he's completely in solitary confinement. So now, over 1,500 days in solitary confinement. That means he sees nobody, not a single person, except for the ones that want to murder him, that want to torture him, that want to interrogate him. And some of the information is public because the Islamic regime, when they kidnapped my father, they didn't make it a secret. They publicly showed on TV my father's face, swollen and with his eyes closed, like he had I forgot what it's called, like a bandage around his eyes. Forced to confessions, and they were pretty much broadcasting to the world, we just kidnapped a German American national and took him over here, and we're forcing him to confessions, and nobody did anything about that. So most of the information is public. We can see it because the regime is so unhinged that they publicly show their terrorism and nobody is responding to it. We show that they showed that my dad was taken to several sham trials, kangaroo trials, and you can see him seeing in a courtroom, which is not a real court. They replaced all of our real courts with revolutionary courts. The revolutionary courts have revolutionary judges, which are not judges, they're agents of the Islamic regime. They have revolutionary laws and Sharia laws, which are not real laws. They make them up. They have charges like corruption on earth, which nobody knows what that is, or war against God that they bring up against dissidents. So when you're speaking out, like I'm doing right now, against the Islamic regime, you're charged with corruption on earth, and corruption on earth has the death sentence as the sentence. So in 2022, February 2022, they revealed that my dad received the death sentence. So right now, he's not just tortured in those torture chambers for 4 years, he also has the threat of execution. That means at any time, they can come and take him out of his cell or wherever they're holding him and execute him. And in Iran, they do that very publicly on a crane and hang you. So this is the horror that the Islamic regime is not hiding. This is just a public horror that they're showing, what they want to do to a German-American journalist.
And nobody talks about any human rights, you know? Do you get any assistance from, because your father was not an Iranian citizen, so do you get any collaboration from your government, from American government or Dutch, German government, maybe?
You would think that, right? You would think like when the worst thing in your life happens, when a terrorist regime kidnaps your father and you have 2 citizenships, you would have 2 strong countries next to you. But unfortunately, as we found out, that's not the case when it's a country or it's an organization that these countries have diplomatic or business relationships to. So Germany is still the biggest trade partner of the Islamic regime Europe-wide. The US still has business trades, like they did the JCPOA in 2015. They did hostage negotiations where they're transferring frozen assets to the regime. So when your loved one is taken hostage by a regular person, a regular criminal, you can go to the police. You can go and the police takes care of it and you don't have to do anything. When it's a state actor that is involved in diplomatic games with other countries, you find out that your governments are not interested in helping you. Of course, they still talk to you, like the German government from day one. The embassy talks to us over here. They guarantee us in every talk that we have that they will do everything in their power. But when you look at the facts, when you see that he was kidnapped and there was no reaction, he was tortured, there was no reaction. They knocked out my dad's teeth, there was no reaction. They put him into solitary confinement and he couldn't even breathe. He didn't give his medication that he needed. There was no reaction. The only time there was any reaction from the German government, not even from the American, was when he received the death sentence. That's when Germany decided to have 2 diplomats at the Iranian embassy in Germany being taken out of the country. That was the only time our government did something in action. Other than that, we have not seen them reach out. We have not seen them even be able to locate my father or tell us where he is, how he's doing, or tell us how they're going to get him back, how they're going to save his life. There's nothing that you can see.
And American government, do you get any support or collaboration?
The American government was actually worse. For the first 3 years, the US State Department refused to talk to us, refused completely to even acknowledge that my father is being held there, that we have rights here. So we had to engage with lawyers, we had to get attorneys, we had to go to DC last year in September with other hostage families and do a sit-in strike in front of the State Department in the summer heat with other families sitting there until they said, okay, you can come in and we're going to talk to you. And that was the first time after 3 years that they talked to us. And they told me, Giselle, we're getting some of the hostages back, and your dad is not one of them. And we're going to pay $6 billion, and your dad is still not going to be the one that's going to be released. No explanation why.
Was that the time of Mahsa Amini? Was that the time of Mahsa Amini that the Iranian regime needed money?
That was right at the anniversary of the first year of the revolution. So the revolution in Iran, the Mahsa Amini revolution, the Women Life Revolution, started in 2022, September 2022. And September 2023, it was 12 full months that the people had been on the streets, and the regime was just crumbling over there. And in the height of that revolution, the US government decided to do a hostage deal where they released $6 billion to the regime, which of course saved the regime, crushed the revolution, and also got some hostages back, but not all of them. At least 3 Americans were left behind, including my father with a death sentence. And that was one of the horrific interactions between the Western world and the terrorist regime that we have ever seen. And it can cost my dad his life. It can cost all of them their life, because what happened afterwards, when I was in the State Department, I told them, you're leaving my dad behind. He has a death sentence. How can you guarantee me that he will not be murdered? And how can you guarantee that there will not be more hostages now, since we're incentivizing hostage taking? Like, you're telling the regime, you get 1.2 billion per hostage head if you divide it by 5 people. And they said, what future hostages? 2 weeks later, October 7 happened. And we had 250 new hostages by the regime's proxy, Hamas, taken. And the Hamas officials came forward, of course, and said, now we want a deal. Now we want to do the same hostage negotiations that you did with our partners. And you can see how this horrific business of hostage taking and negotiating with these terrorists is costing all of these people's lives.
I'm glad that you started about the hostages of October 7th. What does it to you? What's your take on it?
I'm just like, I can't even describe it. You see, I'm struggling for words, because we saw this hostage diplomacy, and not just in my dad's case, not just in the case of all of the Europeans and Americans that were taken hostage, and you see how the regime treats them, and you see how European governments tell the families not to talk about it, and don't support the families. You also see it in 45 years of how the regime treats its own citizens. Like all of the dissidents inside of Iran have the same fate as hostages. They're also taken, kidnapped from their families, thrown into jails, raped there, abused there. They have no rights, no defense, no nothing, and then they're executed. Since October 7th, there were more than 1,200 executions, public executions inside of Iran. That's more people than on October 7th. So we have massacres, genocides inside of Iran every single year. Every single year, nobody talks about it. When I saw 250 hostages being taken, it was a deja vu for us to see like the pain that the Iranian people are suffering at the hands of jihadists repeated in Israel now. Now it's a different group of jihadists, right? It's Hamas instead of the Islamic regime with the same message. We will terrorize you. We will kidnap you. We will burn you. We will murder you, and you can do nothing about it because our governments are still negotiating with them. Our governments are still legitimizing them. Our governments look at the Islamic regime as if they were another government and not a jihadist terrorist organization. So one point was this horror of seeing that repeated. The other was a little bit of hope, because for the first time there was 250 hostages. So 250 families spoke up instead of just a couple of us around the world. So the hostage issue became a public issue again after 45 years, after we had the first hostage crisis in Iran. So this is kind of I don't want to say a good thing, but it is at least shedding some light on what these terrorist organizations do on a daily basis. And now we can educate the Western world about what is going on inside of Iran for 45 years, what is going on in the Middle East for 45 years, and now we can start finding ways to solve this problem that we have.
Do you think that what happened on October the 7th was really a kind of act of terror? Because Israel has the most strong intelligence service. How come that they didn't know about the attack? That's a big question that I get from everybody.
You know, because of my dad's case, I speak to experts on a daily basis. Since 2020, when he was kidnapped, I speak to counterterrorism experts from Europe, from Germany, from America. I speak to historic experts. I speak to experts in foreign policy and national security. So this was exactly one of the questions that came up for me, because us, we are on Twitter. We are connected to the people of Iran. We're connected everywhere. We saw the signs. We saw that there was a group of these terrorist heads, officials, meeting in Tehran about 1 week or 2 weeks before October 7th. So we could see there's something brewing. We knew $6 billion were just transferred from our U.S. administration to Qatar. Qatar is the banking place of the Islamic regime and also Hamas. So we knew something was coming up. And that was exactly my question is, how come they did not know? They probably did know. They probably did see some of these things. The problem is, how do you distinguish between some terrorists just like firing around and some terrorists really plotting to do something different? You know, the chain of command in the intelligence services and how it goes up, and how the chatter of what is going on inside of the Middle East reaches the top. That is the place where most of the infiltration can happen. This is how it was explained to me. So this is the place where people can translate what they see on the ground and say, oh, this is just like business as usual, because Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Islamic regime, they never stop. There's never a time where they stop and are in peace. There's constantly something going on. So distinguishing between, is this just business as usual or terrorism as usual, or is this something big? That is where a breach could have happened. That is where a misinterpretation could have happened. That is where infiltration could have happened, because Islamic regime or jihadist agents also infiltrate our highest powers, especially in the US. Last year, Semafor and Iran International showed explicitly that we have agents of the Islamic regime known as the Iran Experts Initiative, working in our Pentagon, working with our intelligence, working in our State Department, working with our government 24/7, getting these kinds of information. So when we know that they have infiltrated the US government, there can be infiltration in Israel, there can be infiltration all over the world happening, and that is how these things happen.
Do you think that, does it show that Islamic regime is so intelligent, or the government of European and American countries, they are so stupid? How is it possible?
I don't think there's any stupidity on the side of our US governments or Western governments. I think we are not the only clever people in this world. We're not the only clever people who found out these are terrorists, these are mass murderers, these commit genocide, there's human rights abuses in the Middle East. These are not real people to deal with. I think they're smart enough to see that too. So when you see governments engaging over and over again, it's not just the Islamic regime. They engage in talks with the Taliban. They engaged in talks with like all of these jihadist organizations. It's not that they're stupid. It's that they think you can make business with these people, which is what they have been doing since the early 1970s, and get away with it, because the effect of the terrorism is not going to reach us here. The effect of the terrorism only is in their own country. Like they thought the Islamic regime will only oppress the people of Iran. What do we care about the people of Iran? Let them die. We don't care. We want to make business. The moment it started to reach Europe, it started to reach America, it started to reach Israel, is when they get the heads up and they're like, oh, how do we contain that? So thinking that you can contain jihadism and still make business, that is the miscalculation. The regime is not the most brilliant one, but it's also not a stupid one. They have very smart people who know how to engage with the Western world. So they don't come over here and say, we're jihadists, we are Islamists, we want to kill. They represent themselves as diplomats. They represent themselves as victims. They represent themselves as victims of sanctions, of being the only one that doesn't have a nuclear weapon, being the only one that is oppressed, that is like standing with the oppressed people of the Middle East, which they don't. We know from our history, they are the oppressors. They are the people who are conquering, infiltrating, and oppressing the people and killing people. But they have a very good system of PR, of showing themselves as human rights related people. And our Western media helps them to portray in that way by focusing on what the public needs to see and not focusing on all of their crimes and everything that they're doing in the Middle East.
Why does the Western media does that? What's in it for Western government?
Anytime we were asking why, we're looking for the solution. That is a very, very important question to ask. Most of the whys go back to money. So once we understand that this is not some big conspiracy, that this is not something like people sitting there and like making plans, but this is just about money and business, we can treat it in such a way. You have to understand that money cartels brought Wall Street, the bazaars in Iran and the Middle East. These kinds of people who want to make money, they're not politically interested. They don't care if Adolf Hitler is ruling the Middle East or if it's Mother Teresa or something else. They want to make sure they have connections with the leaders and rulers of the Middle East, and they can continue in transactions. They have done that since day one, but the biggest transaction that we have seen between the Western world and the Islamic regime has been the nuclear negotiations, or the JCPOA, as they call it, in 2015. In which $150 billion transaction was made with the regime, and billions of dollars have been exchanged. Whenever money is exchanged, brokers make a percentage of that. So these brokers in the West that set up these deals, that set up hostage negotiation deals, that set up JCPOA deals, they get a percentage of whatever deal is made. So in the JCPOA, if we estimate $150 billion, and we estimate 1%, only 1% revenue for the broker who set that up, that is, sorry, my math is so bad, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars at least. These hundreds of millions of dollars are then invested to buy media, to buy politicians, to buy campaigns, to buy entire sectors of our academia, our colleges, Princeton, Harvard, all of our universities, Cambridge, like whatever they called, they started to buy their influence into media, academia, and of course, politics then. So our students that have followed the classrooms where you have bought influence into the Middle Eastern programs, into the history studies, you can see how their textbooks change. You can see how everything's changed. You can see how they've been slowly being brainwashed. And these students then, after generations, we're talking about 45 years since the Islamic regime was established, then go into the out of the classrooms into the media rooms, into the news stations, into the governments, into everything. So they built it over decades from the bottom up with these monies that are made. So I know it sounds very complicated, but once you understand, this is just a money game. Whoever has the money has the influence. And that, unfortunately, has been for the last 45 years, the Islamic regime and its terrorist proxies.
So it was all planned long time ago to get the world to the stage that the world now is. Okay.
It's always been like that. It's always been like when it was when the Middle East was not conquered by the Islamists, it was other people who were making money. So in 1979, when that changed, when the Islamic regime took over, they quickly found a way to find their connections and to make money. And since this money is going to the Islamic regime and their brokers, that is the influence that we're getting in our classrooms in the West, in our media in the West. And this is how it's a vicious cycle. Money goes back in. We portray them as good people. We portray them as people that we need to make business with. Money goes back in. And that's how it has been rolling for the last 45 years.
Okay. Ghazalejan, a lot of people in Europe, they say that Hamas attack of last year was a response to years of oppression and abuse of Israel. How do you see that?
Well, that's, of course, if you don't know anything about the Middle East, that sounds very plausible. That sounds very plausible, especially because for the last decades, Hamas and the Islamic regime that's supporting them has put out these narratives. Again, they reverse the role of victims and oppressors, like they've done inside of Iran. If you look at the history, though, and you can see, first of all, who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor? The people of Gaza are oppressed. That is absolutely correct. They are oppressed. They don't have rights. They don't have schools. They don't have anything. But it is not because there was a Jewish state. They were oppressed before that too. Most of these nations inside of the Middle East have been oppressed for the last 1,400 years. That is when a group of jihadists out of the Arabic Peninsula started to infiltrate and invade the Middle East, taking over nation after nation after nation. I'm speaking about Iran. They took over Iran and replaced it by the Islamic regime. They took over Lebanon and replaced it with Hezbollah.
Are you talking about 1979? Or before that, when Islam
1,400 years ago.
Okay, then Islam came.
Before 1979, yes. 1979 is, so to say, the complete seizure of Iran by the Islamists. But Iran has not been free before that either, for the last 1,500 years. So Iran's history dates back like 6,000 years, 7,000 years, depending on whose book you believe and whose records you believe. We have thousands of years under Zoroastrian kings, and so do the Jewish people. We have Arabic people inside of Arabia, Saudi Arabia, in Middle Eastern history. Never, though, did they come down to the other regions of the Middle East before the 600s BC, which means for the last 1,400 years, there is a group of what we call jihadists, that is Islamist oppressors, that conquered, invaded nation after nation inside of the Middle East and oppressed and replaced the native people of that region, which means they started invading Iran, the Persian empires, and now, of course, through the Islamic regime, our last kingdom, the Pahlavi dynasty, and replaced them with the Islamist regime that is not Iranian, that is not native to us. They replaced the government of Lebanon almost entirely by a jihadist operation that is called Hezbollah. They replaced the Syrians by Hashd militias and the Assad regime. They replaced Afghanistan to the Taliban. They replaced the people of Gaza by an organization that is formed by the Muslim Brotherhood, a Sunni Islamist organization that came over and took and seized power over there and seized land over there. So the native groups of the country. Same with Egypt. Egyptians were not Islamist. They didn't. Now they have the Muslim Brotherhood there. They were not. They had pharaohs and all of those things. So this invasion of the Middle East, the eradication of the nations there, of the cultures there, by these radical Islamist groups, has been going on for millennia. And some people were able to fight back, and some people have been taken over faster. So the struggle between Jewish native people and the invading Arab groups that are now in Gaza and the West Bank is not just since the state of Israel was formed. This has been going on throughout Middle East all of this time. While these Islamists came, they oppressed, they killed, they raped, and they indoctrinated. So Gaza has not been under any kind of occupation for the last 20 years. We know that the Israeli army that had to go in to defend itself against these Islamist group, against this terrorism, withdrew from Gaza in 2005. And they handed it over to the Palestinian Authority back then, which then experienced a coup by Hamas, by the Islamists. So the Palestinian Authority was thrown out of buildings. They were murdered in 2007. There was a big massacre by Hamas against the Palestinian Authority. They took over Gaza, they took over the people, and they oppressed them for 20 years. So when we're talking about oppression, when we're talking about oppression of the Gazan people, we're absolutely right. They have been oppressed. But the oppression was by the Islamists. We did not speak out when they created Islamist school, when they started indoctrinating children, turning them into child soldiers, turning them into suicide bombers, telling them that they have to spend their lives in refugee camps in their own territory. How can you be in a refugee camp in your own territory? That they cannot go to schools, that they cannot have a normal life, but that they have to be raised into believing that they have to either die for their faith or be killed for their faith or kill for their faith. So this abuse of children, this abuse of generation after generation of Gazans, we did not respond to. We only responded to when we saw the effect, when we saw October 7th. Then we said, oh, they have been oppressed, and it was the Israelis. The Israelis did not even occupy Gaza for the last decades. So people who think that are very malinformed based on the indoctrination of our Western society and our Western media that portrays it in a certain way.
It's the same scenario that we've been through in Iran, with the war between Iran and Iraq. We had also child soldiers and everything that people in Gaza are going through. But the people of Gaza are living in what many call an open air prison, and that's because Israel has control over food supply or medicine supply. So how do you explain that for people who say, no, it's not true? Israel abuses Gaza.
It's a very long explanation to go over like all of the misinformation that is out there. I mean, open air prison, when you have any sense of history and the territory called British Mandate Palestine, all of the people that were living there. We had the invading Arab groups that were now for centuries living there, and were now, so to say, native to that area too. We have the Jewish people who have been native there for millennia, of course. They've been living side by side with some problems between them. But at some point, they divided that country into areas where there were Jewish people, into areas that were Arab people, and gave them land. This is how most of the countries of the Middle East were formed, like Jordan, like these partition plans, when they said, this area from now on, if you want to form a state, is going to be called Jordan. And the British colonies withdrew from that area, or the French colonies withdrew from that area and gave it to the people that were living there. The Jewish people, the Israelis, took their part in 1948. The Arab nations did not like that. They were given a big chunk, and they did not want the Jewish state to exist. That's why they did not create their own state, because by creating their own state, called Palestine or whatever they want to call it, they would acknowledge the border to Israel. That means they had to acknowledge that there will be a state attacking. We have several wars in these decades that everybody can Google. This is all Googleable stuff that I'm saying. You don't have to be an expert for that to see how many times they have attacked Israelis, have attacked Israelis. A state is responsible to protect their own people. So Israel's responsibility is towards their own people, to keep them safe from invasions, from wars, from all of these things, from suicide bombings, from terrorist attacks. So looking at this history of continuous terrorism and jihadism, they have to close their borders. So did Egypt, by the way. So Egypt, not wanting this terrorism to continue, made a big border between the Palestinian areas and Egypt to stop that. So nobody's looking at Egypt's role in that. The Palestinian people, or the Arab Palestinians as we call them, have been oppressed, as we said, by the dictators that were in their own countries. So they have been receiving, during all of this time, because of the propaganda that this is an open-air prison, that they don't have this, that they don't have that, millions and millions of dollars in funds, in humanitarian aids. We have whole institutions in the UN, like UNRWA, just specializing and transferring funds from our Western countries, from our tax dollars, to these areas. They did not receive these funds. Why? Because they're occupied by jihadists. Jihadists, like Hamas, take over the money and use it for their own goods. That's why jihadist leadership are always millionaires or billionaires. We see it in Hamas, we see it in Hezbollah, we see it in the Islamic regime. They are millionaires who send their children to Harvard and to Western schools, and they oppress the people and tell them there's an outside bad guy. In the case of Iran, they tell them it's America. In the case of Gaza, they tell them it's Israel. And they always find an outside scapegoat and say, that's the reason that you don't have food. That's the reason that you're oppressed. That's the reason that you don't have what other people have. And they brainwash them to believe that. And they portray that then in the news. And the news gives it to us, and that's why we believe that there is an open-air prison. Yes, there was oppression, there is oppression in the Middle East by jihadists. So when we take care of the problem of jihadism that takes the money from the people, like the Islamic regime is taking the funds of the Iranian people, our oil, our investments, our frozen assets, and then funds terrorist organizations, while our children are starving inside of Iran, while average families cannot survive, when mothers and fathers sell their organs to be able to provide food. That is the problem that we're having.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you think that there are so many more casualties in Gaza than in Israel? We see all the children.
Well, yeah. Yeah, several reasons. One, again, the Israeli government, as a government, you take care of your people. So they invested the funds that they received from the West into an Iron Dome to protect their people. They invested into policies that every house has to have like a bomb shelter. They invested into policies to make sure that these people can survive the constant threat against them. But on the other side, of course, Hamas is not a government. It is a jihadist organization, not interested in the people. people, but only in funding themselves and having power for themselves. They invested the money that they received into terror tunnels, into ammunition, into building a suicide community, and then infiltrated the civil areas. So they're very deeply woven into the areas. We see hospitals that have terror tunnels underneath. We see schools. We see all of these refugee camps that have terror tunnels or bombs, launching pads on them from which they attack the Israelis. So when you're intertwined with a community like that in a state of war, it is very hard to distinguish between them. Well, still, most experts say the Israeli army is doing a phenomenal job of trying to avoid casualties, which I hate calling casualties. Every person dying in a war is a horrible thing, and it's a death. I don't like the casualties. Always sound so casual, but the most important point, and I think everybody misses that, in a state of war, any time in history, in a state of war, we evacuate civilians. Israel evacuated 200,000 people from their north, where Hezbollah is attacking them. They evacuated 100,000 people from the side of Gaza. So they are all like evacuated. They left their homes, they left everything. So they will not be affected. Why is nobody evacuating the civilians inside of Gaza? We have the UN that could come in. We have like NATO that can come in. We did it in Kosovo war. We did it in the Syrian wars. We did it in the world wars. We evacuate civilians and let the militias and the militaries fight each other. But for some reason, we're not doing that in Gaza. Nobody talks about it. We did some plans. We did some suggestions in the beginning of the war where we said, this is a major point where you need to evacuate people. Nobody did it. So we're keeping the civilians there. We're keeping the war going. And when more and more casualties are done, we are putting pressure on Israel to stop the war. Why? Because again, our Western governments are still involved with the terrorist communities like Hamas, like Hezbollah, and they want to continue their business with them. So they want to make sure that they're not eradicated. Unfortunately, this is the money cartel that is behind it. That's why we like to see casualties on TV, to blame it on Israel, not on Hamas, not on the UN, not evacuating these people, not on anybody, but to have the scapegoat again, and then pressure the scapegoat to stop destroying the initial group that started the terror attack. We have seen this. It's not something that we're making up right now. We have seen ceasefires between Israel and Hamas, between Israel and Hezbollah over and over and over again, where casualties are seen in war. We say ceasefire, there's a ceasefire deal. Hamas and Hezbollah get money again, they relaunch, they get more weapons, they attack again, we have a war again, and then we repeat it. So it's a cycle that we see over and over again. That's why it's just ridiculous to think that this is not something new.
Exactly. And the people are the victim. We've seen Hamas, we've seen Hezbollah, we've seen Daesh, Taliban. Where is the head of the snake?
They like to say, head of the snake or head of the octopus. The head of these Shia militias or Shia funded militias is the Islamic regime. They're funding all of these. The head of the Sunni militias is the Muslim Brotherhood. So sometime in the early 1900s, while we were facing the Cold War, there was also a branch of jihadists being sponsored and growing like a cancer in the Middle East. That was the Muslim Brotherhood, and that was the Shia militias. So the Shia militias turned into the Khomeinists, which then took over Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and the Sunni militias turned into the Muslim Brotherhood, which then branched out and had like little quarters like Hamas in different countries that they're still having. These two are two big heads. They're rivals. Like when they come to power, they will destroy each other, but when they are under attack, they sometimes work together because they're both jihadists. They both have the same ideology of taking over the world and turning it into a big caliphate that the Islamists had before under the Ottoman Empire and under previous empires. So that's where they want to go back, and that's why they're occupying the Middle East right now.
Exactly. I was talking to actually a well-respected name in Holland a few days ago, and he thinks that USA is against the regime in Iran, against Ayatollahs, because Ayatollahs don't listen to them, and they want that Ayatollahs want to destroy America. And he is also very angry about Israel, and he told me that Israel wants to destroy your country. And when I told him that people in Iran, they are behind people in Israel, they don't have any problem with each other. And actually, they are also very happy with the steps that Netanyahu is taking right now, because I don't say that Netanyahu is helping people in Iran. He is thinking about his own country and maybe his own position, but it's very helpful to Iranian people. And he was very angry, and he told me, you want to tell me that people in Iran want their country to be destroyed by Israel? And I cannot make that clear for European people. They don't see it. They want
They
to,
can't see it.
yes, they want me to believe that I'm wrong from my own, about how I look at my own country.
It's mind-blowing, right? I mean, they haven't experienced what
Nothing.
you experience on your own flesh, so they cannot understand it, because it doesn't make any sense to them. So you have to walk them step by step through what happened in 1979 inside of Iran. Once they see how that happened, they can see why we see an absolute déjà vu right now when we're looking at Israel. So 1979, let's go back there, Cold War era. So we have like America fighting against the communists, right? The Soviet Union. That's going on all around the world. We have like the communists have parties in every country. And this is the biggest war that you see in every single country, also in Iran. Which side is Iran on at that time? Iran is the biggest ally in the Middle East of America, of the allies. They're fighting against communism as well. So we have the biggest ally of America being Iran there. Now the biggest ally is Israel, right? How are you saying like the biggest ally? What happened to their biggest ally? Well, the Shah was fighting, and the Shah, again, some people love him, some people criticize him. It's absolutely okay. It's okay to criticize your government. That is your right. That is your right. And we need criticism to improve and have better rights. But looking at Iran at that time, the Shah was in a state of rapid modernization. We had the White Revolution. Women's rights were on the rise. We had voting rights before the people in Swiss had voting rights. We had rapid agricultural reforms. We had rapid educational reforms. We had like everything that was going in high speed, like the French Revolution, but in high speed. Instead of like 100 years and 10 years, he was going forward. Who was scared of all of this education and modernization? The Islamists. The clerics who were owning lands, as we said, this goes back to 1,400 years. The clerics and Islamists that were owning the lands and making money, they were now facing educated women. They were now facing educated children. They could say how their power is going to be lost. So they started stirring up the masses. Of course, we had student movements. Of course, we had women movements and some protests, like we have here in the West. Of course, there were human rights problems there, right? But the media, again, infiltrated by the communists, the media focused on these small uprisings that we had. Not small, but they made it a big problem. Like the people of Iran are oppressed by a dictator, and that is the Shah. And this dictator cannot hold back the communists. Well, the communists were on the street with the Islamists. So the unholy marriage that we see today between the far left and the Islamists, we saw in 1979 student movements being hijacked by the jihadists, by Khomeini's people, telling them, if you revolt against the Shah, we will give you free this, free that, free everything. Everything's going to be better. They were manipulated. They were infiltrated. They were brainwashed. Our kids were brainwashed to think that this is the bad guy. The Shah and the West and imperialism is all bad. And if we just stand for a second with these Islamists, these people with the turbans, we will get better rights. What happened? The coup happened. America abandoned their biggest ally in the Middle East and let the Shah fall and didn't back him up. The Islamists took over through a coup. They took all of our ministries and replaced them with jihadist ministries. From the day in 1979 forward, there was executions in the streets, beheading people, raping people, throwing them in jail, mass executions of 30,000 people, mass graves. The people did not understand how that happened, but they fell for the Islamist propaganda. And so fell Iran into the hands of the Islamists. And now we don't have an Iran, we have an Islamic regime. Looking now at Israel, which is, again, the ally of the West, and looking at our students and all over Europe, the people who think the bad guy is Netanyahu. He might do very bad things. He might not be the best person, or he might be the best person. Not for us to judge. But he is a democratic leader. He's not a jihadist like Hamas. He's not a jihadist like Hezbollah. We can see the downfall of Israel. We can see the downfall because we lived it. We saw how America dropped their only ally and replaced them with the Islamist regime. That can happen to Israel now. And Iranians, for that reason, stand with the Jewish people, stand with the Israeli people. They're not endorsing Israel. They're not endorsing that, but they understand we cannot stand with Islamists because this is the result of it. What we have right now, 45 years, is the result of picking the wrong side.
Exactly. But, lots of people say that Hamas is also a democratically chosen government in Gaza. Isn't it right?
No, it's not. It's not. I mean, they had elections. They had elections in 2005, I believe, and they gained a majority, not the majority, but from all of the groups, a majority, and they had to collaborate to make a government. They did not do that. If you ask the Palestinian Authority back then, as I said, there was a genocide, a massacre in 2007. It was a coup to which they took over. They threw people from the Palestinian Authority into the streets. There's videos on YouTube. You can look at 2007 coup Hamas. You can see how demonstrators from the Palestinian Authority were in the streets and Hamas fighters were shooting them. They killed more Palestinians than you can even imagine. These are their own people. So they took over the country by force, just like the Islamic regime has done. And once they are in power, how can you fight them? The moment you criticize them, you get raped and tortured and burned and killed. So of course, after being in power for so long, people are afraid. And when you look at pictures or when you look at videos, you see like masses they're celebrating for Hamas. This is not all of the Palestinian people. They are afraid to speak up. The ones that spoke up, you can see the pictures of them. They're disfigured. They are burned. They're killed. And that is life under the Islamic regime or under Hamas.
Do you think it's a war between or a fight between Islamic regime in Iran and Israel? That Hamas is a proxy. So?
Hamas is the proxy. Hamas is the proxy, but it's not just Israel. So people think like the Islamic regime only wants to take over Israel. They took over Iran first. They took over our country first. So you have to understand that Israel is another step in their conquest of the world. Again, jihadists, their one thing that they want to do is a global caliphate, which means They want to take out the entire world. They started over with Iran. And when we say they started over with Iran, we as Iranians, we get very mad when the Western governments talk about the Islamic regime and call them Iran, or they call them Iranian regimes, or Iranian proxies, or Iranian terrorism. And we're like, what are you talking about? Like, imagine right now for a second that Russia would take over Ukraine and then would start bombarding the rest of Europe, like Holland or like any other place. You would not say the Ukrainian armies or the Ukrainian terror on Europe. You would understand this is Russia, this is Putin taking over Ukraine and shooting from there. This is exactly what happened to Iran. These are anti-Iranian jihadists. They came in 1979. And the first thing that Khomeini vowed in his first speech, he said, I will burn Iran to ashes so that Islam can be lightened up all around the world. And that was the promise.
Yeah.
So this regime is anti-Iranian. It's not Iranian. It is against Iranian. They replaced our government with an Islamic regime. They replaced our constitution with Sharia law. They replaced our courts with Islamic courts. They replaced our flag with a Islamic flag with an Islamic symbol, an Arabic writing on it, not Persian writing, Arabic writing on it. They replaced our anthem. They replaced our culture. They replaced our schools with Arabic scholars. They replaced our temples and mosques with paramilitary bases that they put inside of those temples and mosques. They replaced everything Iranian that we have with Islamism, not Muslim, Islamism, jihadism, and the Western world calls them Iranian.
Yeah, exactly.
This makes us, they're our enemies.
Yeah, it frustrates me, but it's like I cannot win this war. Everybody.
We can.
I know, but sometimes I see so much naive people in Europe. They choose not to see what's happening. And that's scary, actually. That's scary, actually. And it hurts because we all are a victim of what happened in Iran 45 years ago. We all miss our country. We all miss our roots. And we are living with a kind of pain that nobody can experience. And we are trying to warn the rest of the world that this is what's waiting for you if you don't see what's happening. And they call me, they tell me that, Shoreh, you are traumatized. This is not the real picture that you see. You are traumatized. And I tell them, it's my life story. It's what I've been through. It's not a trauma. It's experience.
Yeah.
So please don't be so naive.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not a phobia. It's not like we're imagining that. It is real trauma of real rape, of real, like what my dad is going through. My dad is one story out of hundreds of thousands of people that this is happening to on a daily basis. And they're inside of Iran. So their daughters, when their fathers are kidnapped because they spoke out against the regime, they cannot come like me in front of a camera and speak about it because they'll be killed for that.
Exactly.
So we're speaking on behalf of them. And we're taking this message out to the European people because we know they care about human rights, because they know they care about the values that we care about. But they have been brainwashed. How can you not be brainwashed when 24/7 you're seeing pictures that are influenced by the Islamic regime, that are influenced by these infiltrations and telling you a different story? So the unbrainwashing takes a long time, sure. And each and every one of our voices is valuable in that because we're witnesses to what can happen. We're witnesses of what happens. And now they're seeing it in Europe. Now they can see Russia came and is taking over the Ukraine, and they are using drones by the Islamic regime. So they can see how this regime and their terror doesn't stay over there. It will get their ways. And we can see how synagogues and our Jewish brothers and sisters are harassed in the streets. Iranian dissidents are harassed in the streets. We have death threats. What do? We just speak. Speaking and bringing the truth is so threatening to the regime that invests billions of dollars into this propaganda, that they want to threaten us away. But please don't ever stop talking, and please don't be discouraged by people who just don't know. We were brainwashed at some time. We were brainwashed at some point, right? And believing wrong things. I remember growing up and wearing Che Guevara t-shirts because I thought it's cool. And then I grew up and understood what communism actually means and what is behind it. And then you're thankful for learning that.
We don't have not much time anymore, but I'm very happy that I've talked to you. I just have one question. How do you hold on? What you are going through, it's not nothing, or it's very heavy. What gives you the motivation?
It's very heavy, yeah. It's heavy, and it's like a path that you didn't choose. Nobody chooses this path. Nobody wakes up one day and says, hey, I want to fight against the biggest terrorist organization to save my dad. It's not something that you can prepare for. There's no books written on it. I had to do a lot of research about like understanding the psyche of terrorists. How do they think? What can I do against them? And looking at the people of Iran, especially the 2022 Masa revolution, seeing schoolgirls in the street, facing guns and bullets. I'm not facing guns and bullets. They looked these terrorists in the face and they said, we don't care if you rape me. We don't care if you shoot me, if you shoot out my eyes. But I will not bow to this any longer. I want freedom. When you see that amount of courage in a girl, in a boy, in an older man, how can you not hold on? Like I get chills when I think about these people, but these are the ones that I say, I want to be as courageous as you one day. I'm not yet. I'm speaking behind a camera in a safe country. But one day I want to be as courageous as you. And I owe this to you. I owe this to the world to stand up, tell your story, warn the rest of the world, and make sure I contribute one step towards saving my dad, towards saving other people from this horrific fate. And people like you, around the world who amplify our voices, you're keeping me alive. The people of Iran are keeping me alive. And my daughter is keeping me alive because my daughter was born while my dad was kidnapped and I want her to see him. So that's the three the three parts where I get my energy from, where I'm like, no, I'm not giving up no matter what. One day.
You are courageous, you are beautiful, and like father, like daughter. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope to see you one more time here with us. I love talking to you. I
hope so too. Thank you. You make me cry.
Okay.
مرسی.
تو هم مرسی عزیزم. دست درد نکنه. الان زوم قطع میشه.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you to your team.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Love you. Bye. Beste kijkers, ik wil jullie vragen om met aandacht te kijken naar een kort filmpje dat naar mijn slotwoord in beeld komt. Ik hoop dat dit gesprek jullie ogen heeft geopend voor de complexiteit van het Midden-Oosten en de rol van Iran. Laten we niet vergeten dat achter de politieke krantenkoppen echte mensen, echte families en echte levens op het spel staan.
Let me ask you something. What does it take to stare down a barrel of a gun and still refuse to back down? What kind of a person looks a dictator in the eyes and says, you can imprison me, you can torture me, but you will never take my freedom? What kind of person does it take to know that by raising your voice, you might never see your family again? You might never walk out of that prison alive. And yet you do it anyway. That's courage. That's what the streets of Iran have been paved with. Courage in the quest for freedom. Let me ask you something. What kind of a world do we live in where these freedom fighters, the bravest amongst us, are the ones that we let fall? Didn't we say, women, life, freedom? Go to the streets, hold down the streets, we stand with you. And when they were shot, imprisoned, tortured, and hanged, why did we go on with our lives, hoping someone else will fix it? Let me ask you something. What does it take to call yourself a democratic leader of a free world and still shake hands with the very tyrants who are silencing these brave people? What does it take for you to look into a camera and say, we condemn the Islamic regime and we stand for human rights, while you're signing trade deals, making alliances with the very regimes that stomp on these rights? Where is the courage in that? That's cowardice. And we've seen it over and over and over again. Let me ask you something. Why do we let them get away with it? Is it easier to believe the lies than to confront the truth? Maybe it's easier to fall for regime tactics and fight amongst ourselves activist against activist, dissident against dissident, because we're too scared to face them in power, because we don't know how to do it, but we know how to wage wars in our own communities based on perceived differences, crown versus republic, left versus right, because we need to let our anger out on someone, right? Someone has to pay, but we don't have what it takes to ask those politicians who tell us they care about human rights, what have you actually done? Let me ask you something. Without these freedom fighters, what does our world become? What happens when the last courageous voice is silenced? Have you ever imagined a world where no one stands up anymore because they know no one will stand with them? A world where the only voices left are the voices of those oppressors, where our heroes are buried in unmarked graves and the cowards grow richer and more dangerous and the rest of us are covering in fear and the governments no longer need to pretend to care about human rights because we, the people, will have shown them that we don't care either. When we allow the courageous to be crushed, we're letting tyranny win. We're letting fear rule. When our politicians who we elected make backroom deals with jihadist dictators, when they put profit over people, they're choosing cowardice. But when we stay silent, we're choosing it too. So let me ask you this. What kind of a future do you want? Because the future doesn't just happen. We create it. Tomorrow depends on what we're doing right now. In this moment, the choice is ours. It has always been ours. The people in power only have power because we let them. Because while the people in Iran stood up to guns and batons and brutal oppressors, we couldn't even face the business suits that we elected into power. We choose to be cowards because courage doesn't come easy. It's not born in comfort. It's not found in safety of Western democracies. Courage, bravery, rises from the darkest places where fear grips tightly and danger is all too real. Courage is the act of standing up when everything in the world tells you, shut up and sit down. Shut up and sit down. Let me ask you one last thing. Will we choose to be courageous? Or will we let the cowards decide our fate? For the love of our heroes, will we take on this challenge and will we become the heroes?